Majid Shahriari left his apartment building at 7:43 in the morning. November 29th, 2010. Tehran traffic was already building on Artesh Highway, and he had a lecture at Shahid Beheshti University in 90 minutes. His wife, Vida, slid into the passenger seat of their silver Peugeot 405. She carried a briefcase full of student papers she needed to grade. He checked his mirrors and pulled into traffic. The motorcycle appeared 3 cars back, 2 riders. The passenger wore a green jacket. Shahriari noticed them only because the bike wove through traffic with unusual precision, closing the distance between vehicles without the typical aggression of Tehran motorcyclists. Professional riding. Smooth. He dismissed the thought and merged into the center lane. His phone rang, a colleague asking about the seminar schedule. Shahriari discussed neutron flux calculations while navigating the highway, and when he glanced in the mirror again, the motorcycle was gone. He relaxed his grip on the steering wheel. The bike reappeared at his rear quarter panel. The passenger reached out with something in his hand, a dark object the size of a shoebox. His arm extended toward the Peugeot's rear fender. There was a metallic clunk. The motorcycle accelerated hard and disappeared into traffic before Shahriari could process what had happened. He told his wife something had hit the car. Maybe a stone. They should check for damage at the university. She agreed and returned to her papers. The digital clock on the dashboard read 7:51. The magnetic bomb detonated at 7:52. The shaped charge punched through the rear quarter panel and into the passenger compartment, and the blast wave traveled at 7,000 meters per second. Vida Shahriari died before her neural system could register pain. Her husband survived because the charge was angled away from the driver's seat, but his legs were shattered and his abdomen was perforated with shrapnel. Other drivers stopped. Someone called an ambulance. Shahriari remained conscious for 12 minutes, long enough to tell the first responders that a motorcycle had attached something to his car. 4 kilometers away, on the same highway, at almost the same moment, another motorcycle team executed an identical attack. The target was Faridun Abbasi, a senior scientist at the nuclear facility in Natanz. His wife was also in the car, but Abbasi had combat training from his Revolutionary Guard service, and his reflexes were faster than Shahriari's. He saw the motorcycle passenger reach toward his car. He saw the object in the rider's hand. He yanked the steering wheel hard right and accelerated. The magnetic bomb attached, but the sudden movement shifted its position by 8 inches. When it detonated, the shaped charge blew through the rear door instead of the passenger compartment. Abbasi and his wife suffered burns and concussive injuries, but they survived. He stumbled from the destroyed vehicle and drew a pistol, firing at the retreating motorcycle, but the riders were already gone. Iranian intelligence recovered fragments from both bomb sites. The devices were sophisticated. C4, explosive with precisely machined shaped charges, powerful neodymium magnets, and remote detonators operating on a specific radio frequency. The motorcycles were later found abandoned in different districts of Tehran. They had been stolen 3 weeks earlier. The riders had worn gloves, no fingerprints, no DNA. No witnesses could describe their faces because they wore full helmets and the attacks happened too quickly. The Iranian government announced the attacks at a press conference the next day. 2 nuclear scientists targeted simultaneously on the same highway within minutes of each other. 1 dead, 1 wounded. Both men worked on uranium enrichment. The pattern was obvious. Someone was hunting Iran's nuclear program, and they were using assassination teams that operated with precision inside Tehran itself. This was not the first attack. 10 months earlier, in January 2010, Masoud Ali Mohammadi had left his home in northern Tehran to drive to his university post. A motorcycle packed with explosives was parked near his car. The bomb detonated when Ali Mohammadi approached, triggered by remote control. The blast was powerful enough to shatter windows in buildings 200 meters away. Ali Mohammadi died instantly. Iranian officials claimed he was a nuclear scientist. International observers noted that his research focused on theoretical particle physics, not weapons development. The killing might have been political rather than operational, but it established the method, remote-triggered bombs in Tehran's residential districts during morning routines. Shahriari's death and Abbasi's survival in November made the pattern undeniable. Someone had developed a systematic program to eliminate Iranian nuclear expertise. The attacks were coordinated, professional, and designed to penetrate Iranian security without detection. The operatives knew the scientists' routes. They knew their schedules. They knew which cars they drove and where they parked. This required surveillance networks inside Iran, recruitment of local assets, and intelligence cooperation that extended beyond simple targeting information. Iranian investigators focused on the motorcycles. Tehran had millions of motorcycles, and traffic regulations were loosely enforced, which made motorcycle surveillance and attack extremely effective. The riders could weave through stopped traffic, approach targets from any angle, and escape before security forces could respond. The magnetic bombs were genius tactical innovation, easy to attach in motion, no need to stop, no need to access the vehicle interior. The operative simply reached out while passing, and the magnet did the rest. By the time the target noticed anything unusual, the motorcycle was gone and the timer was running. The sophistication pointed to state intelligence services. Iran publicly blamed Israel and the United States. Israel maintained its standard policy of refusing to confirm or deny covert operations. American officials denied direct involvement, but acknowledged that disrupting Iran's nuclear program was a strategic priority. The truth was that multiple intelligence agencies had been tracking Iranian nuclear scientists for years, building dossiers on their movements, their families, their vulnerabilities. The question was who decided to move from surveillance to assassination, and who provided the operational support to make it happen. Mossad had the strongest motivation and the deepest operational experience inside Iran. Israeli intelligence had been running agents in Tehran since the Shah's era, and those networks had survived the Islamic Revolution by adapting their structure. The Israeli doctrine called for preventing enemy states from acquiring nuclear weapons through any means necessary, including targeted killing. They had killed scientists before, Gerald Bull in Brussels in 1990, who was developing superguns for Saddam Hussein. They had killed Hamas bomb makers in Damascus and Hezbollah commanders in Beirut. Killing Iranian nuclear scientists was consistent with established patterns, but Mossad couldn't operate in Tehran without local help. The attacks required Iranian nationals to conduct surveillance, scout routes, steal motorcycles, plant bombs, and disappear back into the population. This meant recruitment networks inside Iran. The primary source of recruits was the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, the MEK, an Iranian opposition group that had been conducting armed resistance against the Islamic Republic since 1979. The MEK had been designated a terrorist organization by multiple countries, but they had intelligence value because they maintained networks inside Iran, and they were willing to conduct operations that foreign intelligence services couldn't officially endorse. The MEK's relationship with Western intelligence was complicated. They provided information about Iranian nuclear facilities, including the initial exposure of the Natanz enrichment plant in 2002. They also conducted assassinations that aligned with Western strategic interests while maintaining plausible deniability for the governments that used their services. Israeli and American intelligence agencies could provide the MEK with targeting information, technical training, and operational support without directly placing their own personnel at risk inside Iran. After Shahriari's death, Iranian security forces began intensive surveillance of the remaining nuclear scientists. Armed guards followed them to work. Their routes were varied daily. Some scientists were moved to secure housing compounds, but Iran's nuclear program employed hundreds of scientists and engineers, and providing close protection for all of them was impossible. The attackers only needed to identify the key figures, the ones whose expertise was irreplaceable, and then wait for gaps in their security. Dariush Razainajad was killed 7 months later in July 2011. He was riding his motorcycle in East Tehran when 2 motorcycles pulled alongside him. The passenger on one bike drew a pistol and fired 4 shots at close range. Razainajad crashed and died on the roadside. Iranian media reported that he was a nuclear scientist. Western analysts noted that his work focused on neutron triggers, devices that could initiate nuclear chain reactions. This made him a weapons specialist, not a civilian reactor engineer. His death indicated that the assassination program was targeting specific technical expertise rather than the nuclear program in general. The pattern was accelerating. 3 scientists dead in 18 months, multiple others targeted and wounded. Iranian intelligence was hunting for the networks that supported these operations, arresting suspected MEK members and interrogating them for information about foreign handlers. Some arrests were legitimate. Others were opportunistic purges of political dissidents who had no connection to the assassinations. The climate of paranoia inside Iran's scientific community grew worse. Some scientists requested transfers to non-nuclear projects. Others sought permission to leave the country. The psychological impact was exactly what the assassination program intended: disruption, fear, and degradation of expertise. But Iran's nuclear program continued. The enrichment centrifuges at Natanz kept spinning. The heavy water reactor at Arak moved toward completion. Iran's leadership responded to the assassinations by accelerating the program rather than abandoning it. They promoted Faridun Abbasi, the scientist who survived the November attack, to head the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran. The message was defiance. The assassinations would not stop Iran's nuclear ambitions. Israeli intelligence understood this. The assassination campaign was never expected to completely halt the program. The goal was delay and degradation, kill the most experienced scientists, force Iran to train replacements, slow down technical progress, and buy time for diplomatic pressure and economic sanctions to work. Every scientist killed represented 5 to 10 years of irreplaceable expertise. Every attack forced Iran to divert resources into security measures instead of research. The cumulative effect was a program that moved slower and made more mistakes. The question was how long the campaign could continue. Iranian counterintelligence was improving. The motorcycle attacks worked twice, but after Rezanejad's death, security forces began aggressive surveillance of motorcycles near nuclear facilities and scientist residences. The tactics would need to evolve. The next phase of the assassination program would require different methods, deeper penetration, and more sophisticated operational planning. The networks that supported the first wave of attacks were being rolled up. New networks would need to be recruited and trained. The timeline stretched from months to years, and somewhere in Tehran, in a database maintained by Iranian intelligence, sat a list of names: nuclear scientists, weapons experts, the ones whose deaths would hurt the program most. The list was prioritized by importance. At the top of that list was a name that Israeli intelligence had been tracking since the 1990s. A physicist, a project manager, a man who understood every technical aspect of building a nuclear weapon. His name was Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, and he was still alive. The question was how long that would remain true. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh drove to work in an armored vehicle with a security detail. He varied his routes. He avoided predictable schedules. Iranian intelligence had learned from the earlier assassinations and built protective protocols around their most valuable scientists. Fakhrizadeh was untouchable by the methods that killed Shahryari and Rezanejad. Getting close to him would require penetration of his security team or surveillance that could predict his movements weeks in advance. Israeli intelligence had a thick file on Fakhrizadeh that dated back to 1992. He had studied at Shahid Beheshti University, the same institution where Shahryari taught, and earned his doctorate in nuclear physics. In the late 1990s, he became the technical director of what Iran called the Ahmad program. The acronym stood for Applied Research. But Western intelligence agencies understood it as Iran's structured weapons development project. Fakhrizadeh supervised research into uranium metallurgy, high explosive testing, neutron initiators, and missile re-entry vehicle design. These were not civilian reactor technologies. They were the technical components of building a deliverable nuclear weapon. The Ahmad program officially ended in 2003 after international pressure mounted on Iran's nuclear activities. Fakhrizadeh's organization dispersed into smaller units, embedded within legitimate research institutions. He became a professor at Imam Hussein University, a Revolutionary Guard institution in Tehran. His official research focused on theoretical physics. His actual work continued the weaponization studies under different organizational cover. Western intelligence tracked him through intercepted communications, financial transactions, and surveillance of the facilities where his research teams operated. They knew which buildings he visited. They knew which scientists reported to him. They knew he was the irreplaceable center of Iran's weapons knowledge. But knowing his importance and reaching him were different problems. After 2011, the assassination campaign went quiet. No motorcycle attacks, no car bombs. Iranian counterintelligence had improved. The MEK networks that supported the earlier operations were being systematically dismantled. Security forces arrested dozens of suspected collaborators. Some were legitimate MEK operatives. Others were engineers and technicians with access to nuclear facilities who might have provided information to foreign intelligence services. The interrogations were harsh. Several detainees died in custody. The message was clear. Cooperation with foreign intelligence meant death. The pause in assassinations lasted nearly 9 years. This wasn't surrender. It was operational adaptation. Israeli intelligence shifted tactics from direct action to cyber warfare and sabotage. The Stuxnet computer worm, deployed around 2009, had damaged centrifuges at Natanz by causing them to spin at destructive speeds while reporting normal operation to monitoring systems. The attack destroyed nearly 1,000 centrifuges before Iranian engineers discovered the malware. It was cyber sabotage that achieved what physical attacks couldn't: direct damage to the enrichment infrastructure itself. But cyber operations had limits. Iran rebuilt the damaged centrifuges and improved its network security. The enrichment program recovered. By 2015, Iran had enough enriched uranium to build multiple weapons if it chose to take that final step. International negotiations led to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, which promised sanctions relief in exchange for strict limits on Iran's nuclear activities. Iran agreed to reduce its enriched uranium stockpile, limit its centrifuge numbers, and accept international inspections. The deal removed some of the immediate crisis pressure, but it didn't eliminate Iran's nuclear infrastructure. The knowledge remained. The facilities remained. Fakhrizadeh remained. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu opposed the JCPOA from the start. He called it a dangerous agreement that gave Iran economic relief without permanently dismantling its weapons capability. Israeli intelligence believed that Iran was continuing weaponization research in secret, despite the agreement's restrictions. Fakhrizadeh was the evidence. His research teams continued operating. His budget continued flowing through Revolutionary Guard accounts. His movement suggested ongoing work at facilities that weren't covered by international inspections. In 2018, Mossad executed one of its most ambitious operations in decades. A team broke into a warehouse in the Shorabad district of Tehran that housed Iran's nuclear archive. Documents, blueprints, computer files, and technical records from the Ahmad program and its successor projects. The warehouse was protected by electronic security, but not heavily guarded because Iranian intelligence believed the location was secret. The Mossad team bypassed the security systems, cut through 32 safes using specialized torches, and loaded 1/2 ton of documents and computer disks into trucks. They drove the material out of Iran through Azerbaijan. The operation took 6 hours and 50 minutes. Iranian security didn't discover the theft until the next morning. The stolen archive proved that Iran had lied about the scope of its weapons program. Documents showed detailed work on warhead designs, detonation systems, and delivery mechanisms. Computer files contained modeling of nuclear explosive yields. Fakhrizadeh's name appeared throughout the archive as the technical supervisor. Netanyahu revealed the stolen documents in a televised presentation in April 2018, displaying pages from the archive and identifying Fakhrizadeh by name as the head of Iran's weapons program. It was the first time the Israeli government had publicly named him. That acknowledgement changed his status from intelligence target to declared enemy. The presentation served multiple purposes. It undermined the JCPOA by showing that Iran had concealed weapons work. It pressured the United States to withdraw from the agreement, which President Trump did a month later. And it sent a message to Fakhrizadeh himself. Israeli intelligence knew everything about his work, his organization, and his role. They had his records. They had his research. They knew where he fit in the program. The implicit threat was clear. Iranian security increased Fakhrizadeh's protection again. His movements became more restricted. He rarely appeared in public. When he traveled, his convoy included multiple vehicles with armed guards. Iranian intelligence also began feeding false information into channels they suspected were compromised, testing whether foreign agencies were tracking Fakhrizadeh through signals intelligence or human sources. Some of the disinformation worked. Western intelligence agencies received reports placing Fakhrizadeh at locations he never visited, suggesting meetings he never attended. The fog of conflicting information made operational planning difficult. But Mossad had advantages that Iranian counterintelligence couldn't completely neutralize. The stolen archive included personnel lists, names of scientists and engineers who worked in Fakhrizadeh's organization. Some of those people could be recruited, some could be pressured, some might have grievances against the regime that made them vulnerable to approach. Israeli intelligence began working through the list systematically, identifying candidates for recruitment and building profiles of their vulnerabilities, financial problems, family members living abroad, ideological disagreements. The usual levers that intelligence services use to flip sources. One name on the list belonged to an engineer who worked on telemetry systems. His brother had fled Iran during the 2009 Green Movement protests and lived in Germany. The brother had debt problems and no legal status. Israeli intelligence approached him through a cutout and made an offer: money to clear the debt, help with asylum paperwork, and a German residency permit. The price was access to his brother in Iran. The brother initially refused. Then his mother became ill and needed expensive medical treatment that Iran's healthcare system wouldn't cover. The brother agreed to ask a few questions during family phone calls. Nothing that would raise suspicion. Just innocent conversation about work schedules and traffic patterns. The information was fragmented and required months to assemble into useful intelligence. Fakhrizadeh's routine emerged slowly. He lived in a compound northeast of Tehran, in Absard, a rural area about 70 kilometers from the capital. He traveled to Tehran for meetings, but worked primarily from a secure facility near his residence. The facility was disguised as an agricultural research center. Satellite imagery showed standard warehouse buildings and vehicle parking, nothing that indicated nuclear research. The security was subtle but thorough. Cameras, motion sensors, guard patrols that appeared to be maintenance staff. Israeli intelligence needed more than schedules and locations. They needed real-time tracking to know when Fakhrizadeh moved and which route he took. This required technical surveillance, GPS trackers, cell phone monitoring, or compromised vehicles. Getting devices into Fakhrizadeh's security envelope was nearly impossible. His vehicles were maintained by Revolutionary Guard mechanics in secure facilities. His communications devices were government-issued and regularly inspected. Direct surveillance by agents on the ground was too risky because Iranian counterintelligence had become aggressive about identifying foreign operatives. The solution came from an unexpected source. Fakhrizadeh's security detail included drivers and bodyguards who were Revolutionary Guard members, but they were still Iranian citizens with families and lives outside their duties. One of the drivers had a son who attended university in Tehran and had gotten involved with student activists who opposed the government. The son wasn't MEK. He was part of the younger generation that wanted reform, not revolution. But he attended meetings where MEK recruiters operated, and eventually he met someone who claimed to represent European human rights organizations documenting Iranian government activities. The recruiter was actually a Mossad cutout, an Iranian exile who ran a network of low-level sources. The son provided information about student protests and government surveillance of campuses. Small stuff. Nothing that compromised his father. But the recruiter was patient and built trust over 8 months of meetings. Eventually, the conversation shifted to the son's family. His father worked security, important government work. The son was proud of this, even though he opposed the regime politically. The recruiter asked casual questions. Where did his father work? What kind of security? The son gave vague answers. Then the recruiter offered money, not for information about his father's work, just for letting the recruiter know when his father was working versus on leave. Simple presence confirmation. The recruiter explained that human rights organizations needed to know when government security personnel were deployed to suppress protests. The logic was thin, but the money was real, and the son had expenses. He agreed to send text messages indicating whether his father was working or home. Nothing more detailed than that. The messages were useless by themselves, but combined with other intelligence streams, they helped establish pattern confirmation. When the driver was working, Fakhrizadeh was moving. When the driver was off duty, Fakhrizadeh was static at his compound. Over 6 months, the pattern solidified. Israeli intelligence could predict with reasonable confidence when Fakhrizadeh would travel to Tehran based on the driver's schedule combined with signals intelligence about meeting preparations at Revolutionary Guard headquarters. But prediction wasn't enough. They needed certainty. They needed to know the exact moment Fakhrizadeh entered his vehicle, the exact route he would take, and the exact timing of his arrival at specific locations. This required active surveillance on the day of the operation, which meant having assets positioned along possible routes with communication to relay information in real time. Setting up that surveillance network without Iranian counterintelligence detecting it required months of preparation and personnel who could blend into Iranian society without raising suspicion. Mossad had been cultivating such networks since the early 2000s. Iranian Jews who emigrated to Israel sometimes agreed to return temporarily for specific operations. Kurdish separatists in northwestern Iran provided logistical support in exchange for Israeli funding and weapons. Azerbaijani intelligence cooperated on operations that targeted Iran in exchange for Israeli military technology. These networks weren't centrally controlled. They operated in cells with limited knowledge of each other's existence. A surveillance team watching a highway checkpoint wouldn't know about the team watching the target compound. Compartmentalization protected the overall operation if one cell was compromised. By early 2020, Israeli intelligence had built enough infrastructure around Fakhrizadeh to attempt a targeted killing. But the operational plan kept getting delayed. The COVID pandemic disrupted travel and made foreign operatives more visible. Iranian security forces used pandemic restrictions as justification for additional checkpoints and surveillance. The timing wasn't right. Mossad director Yossi Cohen wanted conditions that gave his teams maximum chance of success and minimum risk of capture. An assassination attempt that failed and exposed Israeli operatives in Iran would be worse than no attempt at all. The decision came from the political level. Netanyahu was facing corruption charges and a difficult election. He needed a dramatic security achievement to bolster his political position. The Abraham Accords had normalized relations between Israel and several Arab states, but Iran remained the central threat in his political narrative. Taking out Fakhrizadeh would be a message to Iran, to domestic critics, to the incoming Biden administration that might return to the JCPOA. The order went to Mossad in October 2020. Plan the operation, execute before the American election if possible. If Trump lost, the window for aggressive action against Iran might close. Cohen's operational team had two competing plans. The first involved a car bomb triggered when Fakhrizadeh's convoy passed a specific location. Simple, proven, difficult to trace. The second involved an ambush using a remote-controlled weapon system that could engage the target from a distance without exposing operatives to immediate counterattack. More complex, more expensive, but more precise and potentially more deniable. Cohen chose the second option. The weapon system would be smuggled into Iran in pieces, assembled near the ambush site, and operated remotely from outside the country. After the attack, it would self-destruct, eliminating physical evidence. The components entered Iran through different routes over 3 months. Machine parts hidden in commercial cargo through Turkey. Electronics disguised as agricultural equipment through Azerbaijan. The actual weapon, a modified machine gun with computer targeting systems, came disassembled in a diplomatic pouch through an allied intelligence service that had less scrutiny crossing Iranian borders. The pieces were stored in safe houses and workshops operated by MEK cells that didn't know the ultimate purpose of the items they held. Assembly happened in a warehouse outside Absard, close to Fakhrizadeh's compound. The workshop belonged to a construction company that was actually an MEK front. The technicians who assembled the weapon system were told they were building surveillance equipment. Only 2 people knew the true purpose, and both were Israeli intelligence officers operating under deep cover in Iran. They had been in country for 5 months, running a trading business that imported industrial machinery. Their cover was solid enough to pass routine security checks, but it wouldn't survive intensive investigation if Iranian intelligence started looking closely. The weapon system was mounted in the bed of a Nissan pickup truck that looked identical to dozens of other work vehicles on rural Iranian roads. The truck was parked near the route that Fakhrizadeh's convoy used most frequently when traveling from Absard to Tehran. Surveillance had established that Friday afternoons were his most predictable travel window. He met with senior Revolutionary Guard commanders in Tehran on Friday evenings to discuss program status. The convoy would pass through a specific section of road where buildings provided cover for the truck's position, and escape routes were available if security forces responded quickly. The date was set for November 27, 2020. Fakhrizadeh would either pass that day or the operation would be scrubbed and reset for the following week. The surveillance teams were in position. The weapon truck was parked. The remote operators were in a facility in Tel Aviv, connected through encrypted satellite communications that bounced through 3 countries to hide the origin point. The system was tested and ready. The only variable was whether Fakhrizadeh would actually make the trip that day, and whether his security team would alter the route at the last minute. Iranian counterintelligence sometimes forced random route changes to prevent exactly this kind of planned ambush. If the convoy didn't appear, months of preparation would be wasted and the entire network might be compromised because Iranian security would start investigating why foreign intelligence had been so focused on that particular stretch of road. The surveillance team sent a signal at 1:15 in the afternoon. Fakhrizadeh's convoy had left the compound. They were headed east on the main road, not the alternate route through the mountain pass. 3 vehicles. The lead car carried 4 bodyguards. Fakhrizadeh rode in the middle vehicle, a black Nissan Tiana sedan with armored panels and bulletproof glass. His wife sat beside him. The trail car held 3 more guards, standard protective convoy formation. The surveillance team counted the vehicles and confirmed the target was in the middle position based on the license plate number. They transmitted the information through a coded message that looked like a business text about construction supplies. In Tel Aviv, the remote operators activated the weapon system. Cameras mounted on the truck bed provided a view of the road. The truck was parked 90 meters from the convoy's expected path, angled to give the weapon a clear field of fire. The operators had rehearsed the engagement sequence dozens of times, using simulation software that modeled ballistics, vehicle speed, and targeting precision. The machine gun was a FN Mag 7.62 mm weapon modified with a computerized firing control system and a recoil dampening mount. The system could track moving targets and compensate for distance and wind. The effective range was 800 meters, but accuracy dropped significantly beyond 300. At 90 meters, the system could place rounds in a 6-inch circle if the target was stationary, 12 inches if moving. The convoy appeared at 1:37. The lead vehicle passed the truck's position. The operators waited. Engaging too early would alert the trail car and give them time to position themselves between the weapon and the target. The targeting camera locked onto the middle vehicle. The system's computer identified the optimal firing window, a 3-second interval when the target car would be broadside to the gun position with no obstructions. The operators armed the weapon. The camera showed Fakhrizadeh visible through the sedan's windows. His wife was talking. He was looking at his phone. The weapon fired a controlled burst, 15 rounds in 2 seconds. The ballistic computer adjusted aim between shots to compensate for the vehicle's movement. The first 3 rounds hit the rear passenger door and failed to penetrate the armored panels. The next 5 rounds hit the rear window and spiderwebbed the bulletproof glass, but didn't break through. The trajectory was wrong. The angle wasn't giving the rounds enough penetration force. The operators adjusted and fired again. This burst targeted the windshield, a weaker point in the vehicle's armor scheme. 6 rounds hit the glass. 2 penetrated. 1 struck the dashboard. 1 hit Fakhrizadeh in the right shoulder. The convoy reacted immediately. The lead car accelerated and turned sideways to block the road ahead, creating a defensive position. The trail car pulled alongside Fakhrizadeh's sedan on the opposite side from the gun position, using its bulk to shield the target vehicle. The bodyguards exited with the weapons drawn. They couldn't identify where the shots came from because the weapon was hidden in the truck bed and the suppressor reduced the muzzle flash. They scanned buildings and the roadside. Fakhrizadeh's driver accelerated forward and then stopped, confused by the lead car blocking his path. The operators fired a third burst, 20 rounds. The targeting system focused on the driver's side of the windshield, trying to incapacitate the driver and stop any escape attempt. Multiple rounds hit. The windshield shattered. The driver took 3 rounds to the chest and slumped forward. Fakhrizadeh opened his door and stumbled out of the vehicle, clutching his shoulder. His wife screamed at him to stay in the car. He ignored her. He was bleeding but mobile. The bodyguards converged on him, trying to pull him behind the armored sedan for cover. One of the guards spotted the truck. He pointed and shouted. 2 guards opened fire on it, their rifles cracking in rapid semi-automatic bursts. Rounds punched through the truck's cab and bed. 1 struck the weapon mount. The targeting camera went dark. The remote operators lost their visual feed. They switched to a backup camera with a wider angle but less resolution. The image was grainy and jumping with each impact on the truck. They could still see Fakhrizadeh, now on the ground with guards surrounding him. The targeting computer couldn't get a lock with bodies moving in and out of the frame. The operators fired again without computer assistance, manual control, walking rounds across the position where Fakhrizadeh had fallen. The guards were trying to drag him toward the trail car. 1 guard took a round in the leg and went down. Another was hit in the shoulder. They dropped Fakhrizadeh and returned fire. The sustained shooting from the convoy positions began hitting the weapon system itself. The mount took multiple impacts. The gun's traverse mechanism jammed. The operators could no longer aim. They triggered the self-destruct sequence. The truck exploded. The weapon system, the cameras, the communications gear, the mount, everything detonated in a shaped charge designed to obliterate evidence. The blast scattered fragments across 50 meters. The chassis burned. The bodyguards hit the ground at the explosion. When they got up, the threat was gone. Smoke rose from the destroyed truck. Small fires burned in the wreckage. The guards focused back on Fakhrizadeh. He was conscious, but losing blood. The shoulder wound was serious, but not immediately fatal. More concerning were the rounds that had hit him when he was on the ground. His abdomen showed multiple wounds. The guards applied pressure and called for medical evacuation. The convoy's armored vehicles had medical kits, but these injuries needed surgery. An ambulance arrived 18 minutes later. Iranian emergency response had been pre-positioned nearby based on intelligence that the convoy route was being surveilled. This suggested that Iranian security knew something was planned, or at least suspected enough to prepare medical assets. Fakhrizadeh was loaded into the ambulance and transported to a hospital in Tehran. The bodyguards established a perimeter around the attack site and prevented civilians from approaching. Within 30 minutes, Iranian intelligence teams arrived to process the scene. The investigation began immediately. The destroyed truck was photographed and documented. fragments of the weapon system were collected. The investigators found pieces of the machine gun, bits of the targeting computer, and shrapnel from the self-destruct charge. They also found bullet casings from the convoy guard's return fire, but no casings from the weapon itself. The system had been designed to catch and contain spent brass. The truck's VIN was traced to a construction company in Absard. The company's records showed it had been reported stolen 2 weeks earlier. The theft report was likely false, filed after the truck was acquired for the operation to create cover. Fakhrizadeh underwent emergency surgery at Imam Khomeini Hospital in Tehran. The surgical team worked for 3 hours. The shoulder wound was manageable. The abdominal wounds were the critical issue. At least 3 rounds had penetrated his lower torso, damaging his intestines and causing internal bleeding. The surgeons repaired what they could, but the trauma was extensive. Fakhrizadeh remained in surgery until early evening. He died at 6:30 that night from complications related to blood loss and organ damage. Iranian state media announced his death at 7:15. The initial reports described him as a prominent scientist killed by terrorists. They didn't mention the weapon system or the remote operation. Within hours, that changed. Revolutionary Guard commanders gave interviews describing a sophisticated assassination using artificial intelligence and satellite-controlled weapons. They claimed Fakhrizadeh had been killed by Israeli intelligence using technology provided by the United States. The descriptions were accurate enough to suggest that investigators at the scene had identified the weapon system's components and traced them to Israeli military technology. The Iranian government response was immediate and severe. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei issued a statement calling for retaliation against those responsible for Fakhrizadeh's death. He didn't name Israel directly, but the implication was clear. Revolutionary Guard commanders promised that Iran would respond at a time and place of its choosing. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani blamed Israel explicitly and warned that Iranian patience had limits. The rhetoric was aggressive, but the actual response options were limited. Direct military action against Israel would trigger a larger conflict that Iran couldn't afford. Covert retaliation through proxy forces in Lebanon, Syria, or Iraq was possible, but Israel had strong defensive measures against those threats. The more immediate Iranian response focused on internal security. Revolutionary Guard intelligence arrested dozens of suspected Mossad collaborators in the days following Fakhrizadeh's death. The investigation into the assassination quickly identified the construction company that owned the truck. Everyone associated with that company was detained. Some were MEK members who had facilitated logistics. Others were legitimate employees who had no knowledge of the operation, but were arrested anyway because Iranian security needed to demonstrate action. The interrogations were harsh. Several detainees died, others provided information under duress that led to additional arrests. The network that had supported the assassination began to collapse. The engineer whose brother provided information about schedules disappeared, arrested or fled. Intelligence agencies couldn't confirm which. The driver, whose son sent text messages about work schedules, was detained and interrogated. He knew nothing about his son's activities, but that didn't matter. He was held for 3 months before being released without charges. His son was never found. Iranian intelligence assumed he had been extracted by Mossad before the operation, a standard procedure to protect sources who contributed to high-value operations. Israeli intelligence didn't confirm or deny responsibility. Prime Minister Netanyahu gave a brief statement acknowledging Fakhrizadeh's death and noting that he had been identified as the head of Iran's nuclear weapons program, but stopping short of claiming Israeli involvement. The ambiguity was intentional. Israel wanted Iran to know that it could reach high-value targets inside Iranian territory, but it didn't want to provide explicit evidence that would force Iran to respond militarily. The message was delivered through operational success, not through public boasting. American intelligence agencies were surprised by the operation's timing. President Trump was in his final weeks in office. President-elect Biden had promised to rejoin the JCPOA and restart negotiations with Iran. The assassination complicated those plans by provoking Iranian hardliners and reducing the space for diplomatic engagement. Some analysts believed that Netanyahu had deliberately timed the operation to sabotage Biden's Iran policy before it could begin. Others argued that the timing was tactical. Fakhrizadeh's schedule and the operational window had aligned in late November, and delaying would have risked losing the opportunity entirely. The Biden administration took office in January 2021 with Iran policy already complicated by Fakhrizadeh's death. Iranian officials indicated they wanted sanctions relief and a return to the JCPOA, but they also demanded accountability for the assassination. The negotiations became deadlocked over issues that extended beyond the nuclear program, Iran's missile development, its support for proxy forces in the region, and its demands for guarantees that the United States wouldn't withdraw from future agreements the way Trump had withdrawn from the JCPOA. The assassination had achieved its tactical objective, killing Iran's most important nuclear weapons expert, but the strategic impact was less clear. Fakhrizadeh's death didn't stop Iran's nuclear program. His subordinates continued the work. Iran announced that it would enrich uranium to 20% purity, then to 60%, levels that had no civilian application but brought Iran closer to weapons-grade material. The enrichment was a message: kill our scientists, and we accelerate the program rather than abandon it. Iranian leadership calculated that international pressure would eventually force negotiations regardless of how aggressive Iran's nuclear activities became, and that calculation proved partially correct. By mid-2021, the United States and Iran were engaged in indirect negotiations through European intermediaries about terms for reviving the JCPOA. But Iran's scientific capacity had been degraded. Fakhrizadeh had been irreplaceable. His knowledge of weapons design, his management of the research teams, his ability to integrate different technical components into a functional weapons program, these capabilities took decades to develop and couldn't be quickly replaced. Iran promoted several of his deputies to leadership positions, but none had his breadth of expertise. The program became more fragmented, with different teams working on separate components without the central coordination that Fakhrizadeh had provided. This fragmentation slowed progress and increased the likelihood of technical failures. Israeli intelligence assessed the assassination as operationally successful but strategically incomplete. Fakhrizadeh was dead, but the program survived. The networks that supported the operation had been compromised, reducing Israel's capability to conduct similar operations in the near term. Iranian security had improved after each assassination, and Fakhrizadeh's death would trigger further improvements that would make future operations even more difficult. The window for targeted killings inside Iran was closing. The next phase of confrontation would likely involve different methods: cyber attacks, sabotage of facilities, interdiction of equipment shipments, pressure on Iran's regional proxy forces. The assassination also created a precedent that concerned some intelligence professionals. Remote-controlled weapon systems operated via satellite represented a significant technological threshold. The Fakhrizadeh operation demonstrated that intelligence agencies could now kill targets from thousands of kilometers away using autonomous or semi-autonomous systems. This capability raised questions about accountability, proportionality, and the future of covert action. If operations could be conducted without personnel on the ground, would intelligence agencies become more willing to undertake riskier missions because the risk was being shifted to technology rather than people? Iranian intelligence was asking the same questions. They knew that Fakhrizadeh had been killed by a remote weapon system. They knew the technology required satellite communications, advanced targeting computers, and precision-guided ammunition. They also knew that similar systems could be used against other high-value targets: political leaders, military commanders, intelligence officials. The assassination changed Iran's threat assessment. Iranian security forces began implementing counter-surveillance technologies designed to detect and jam drone operations, satellite communications, and remote weapon systems. They also accelerated Iran's own development of similar capabilities, reasoning that if Israel could kill Iranian officials remotely, Iran should develop the capacity to respond in kind. The broader intelligence community watched the operation with professional interest. The Fakhrizadeh assassination was analyzed in detail by intelligence services in the United States, Britain, France, Russia, and China. Each service drew its own conclusions about tactics, technology, and operational security. Some aspects of the operation were brilliant: the remote weapon system, the network compartmentalization, the extraction protocols. Other aspects revealed vulnerabilities: the length of time required to position assets, the difficulty of maintaining operational security over extended deployments, the risk that any one arrested operative could compromise multiple cells through interrogation. The lessons learned from Fakhrizadeh's assassination influenced intelligence operations for years afterward. Remote weapon systems became more common in targeted killing operations. Operational security protocols were revised to account for longer surveillance exposure periods. Recruitment networks were restructured to minimize the damage from any single compromise. The Iranian nuclear scientist's assassination campaign, which had begun in 2010 with Mossad Mohammadi and concluded in 2020 with Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, became a case study in both the capabilities and the limits of covert action against hardened targets in denied territory. By the end of 2021, the full impact of the decade-long campaign was becoming clear. Iran had lost at least 5 nuclear scientists in a decade: Mossad Mohammadi in 2010, Majid Shahriari in 2010, Darioush Rezaeinejad in 2011, Mostafa Ahmadi Roshan in 2012, another magnetic bomb attack in Tehran traffic, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh in 2020. Each death represented years of irreplaceable expertise. The cumulative impact on Iran's nuclear program was measurable. Technical progress slowed. Projects were delayed or canceled. Younger scientists were reluctant to work on weapons-related research because the job came with a target designation. Iranian security forces implemented new protocols for protecting the remaining senior scientists. Armed guards became permanent fixtures. Scientists were moved to secure compounds with controlled access. Their families were relocated to housing complexes with perimeter security. Travel was restricted and required advance approval from Revolutionary Guard intelligence. Some scientists balked at the restrictions and requested transfers to non-sensitive research programs. Iran's nuclear establishment was becoming a prison for its most talented people. But the deeper problem was recruitment. Iran needed new generations of nuclear scientists to maintain the program, and the assassination campaign had poisoned that recruitment pipeline. University students who might have pursued nuclear engineering instead chose other fields. The combination of international sanctions limiting career prospects and the physical danger of working on nuclear projects made the field unattractive. Iran's scientific institutions struggled to fill positions that would have had dozens of qualified applicants before the assassinations began. The Iranian government responded by increasing incentives, higher salaries, better housing, guaranteed employment. They also increased penalties. Scientists who attempted to leave the program faced investigation and potential prosecution for security violations. The combination of carrots and sticks kept some people in place, but it couldn't replace the lost expertise. Fakhrizadeh's knowledge in particular was irreplaceable. His deputies understood individual components of weapons design, but none had the integrated knowledge to oversee the entire system: the physics, the engineering, the industrial processes, the quality control, the testing protocols. That knowledge died with him. Iran's response to the assassinations wasn't limited to defensive security measures. Revolutionary Guard intelligence launched its own targeting campaign against Israeli and American interests in the region. In 2012, Iranian-backed operatives attempted to bomb Israeli diplomats in India, Georgia, and Thailand. The India attack wounded 4 people. The Georgia attack failed when the bomb didn't detonate. The Thailand attack was disrupted by police who arrested the operatives before they could complete their mission. The attacks were poorly executed compared to the precision that killed Iran's scientists, but they demonstrated Iran's willingness to respond. Iranian proxy forces in Lebanon and Syria also increased attacks on Israeli targets. Hezbollah, funded and trained by Iran, launched rockets into northern Israel and attempted infiltrations across the Lebanese border. Iranian-backed militias in Syria fired rockets toward Israeli positions in the Golan Heights. These attacks rarely caused significant damage because Israel's air defense systems intercepted most projectiles, but they maintained pressure and forced Israel to expend resources on defensive operations. The more significant Iranian response came through cyber warfare. Iranian intelligence had been building cyber capabilities for years, and after Fakhrizadeh's death, those capabilities were directed against Israeli infrastructure. Iranian hackers targeted Israeli water systems, attempting to alter chlorine levels in water treatment facilities. They attacked Israeli financial institutions, attempting to disrupt banking services. They penetrated Israeli government networks and exfiltrated data about security protocols and emergency response systems. The attacks were mostly nuisance-level disruptions rather than catastrophic damage, but they showed Iran's growing sophistication in cyber operations. Israel responded with its own cyber attacks. Stuxnet had been the opening move, but subsequent operations became more aggressive. In 2020, Israeli cyber teams successfully sabotaged Iran's Natanz enrichment facility by causing a fire that destroyed advanced centrifuges. The attack was traced to compromised control systems that had been penetrated months earlier through a supply chain attack, malware inserted into equipment before it was delivered to Iran. The fire destroyed substantial infrastructure and forced Iran to rebuild sections of the facility with less advanced equipment. Iranian investigators discovered the malware, but struggled to remove it completely from their networks. The code was sophisticated and had multiple redundant access points. Even after cleaning compromised systems, Iranian engineers found residual infections that reactivated and spread through their networks. Israeli intelligence had designed the malware with persistence mechanisms that made complete removal extremely difficult. The psychological impact was significant. Iranian nuclear facilities operated under the assumption that their control systems were compromised, which slowed operations and forced extensive manual verification of automated processes. The assassination campaign also had diplomatic consequences. European governments, which had been mediating between Iran and the United States on nuclear negotiations, expressed concern about the targeted killings. France, Germany, and Britain issued statements condemning violence and calling for diplomatic solutions. These statements were carefully worded to avoid explicitly blaming Israel, but the message was clear. The assassinations complicated diplomatic efforts and made negotiations more difficult. European intelligence services privately communicated to Mossad that the operations were counterproductive and risked undermining the coalition that had been assembled to pressure Iran economically. Israeli officials argued that the assassinations were necessary because diplomatic pressure alone wouldn't stop Iran's weapons program. They pointed to the JCPOA as evidence. Iran had agreed to limits on its nuclear activities, but had continued weapons-related research in secret. Fakhrizadeh's organization had remained operational throughout the JCPOA period. The stolen archive proved this. Without the threat of direct action against key personnel, Iran had no incentive to genuinely abandon its weapons ambitions. The assassinations, combined with sabotage and cyber attacks, were essential components of a strategy to delay Iran's program until regime change or diplomatic breakthroughs made weapons development unfeasible. American intelligence had mixed views on the campaign. Some officials believed the assassinations were tactically effective, but strategically questionable because they hardened Iranian positions and made diplomatic engagement more difficult. Others argued that Iran only engaged in serious negotiations when faced with credible military pressure, and the assassinations demonstrated that pressure more effectively than abstract threats. The debate continued through multiple administrations. with each new president reevaluating policy toward Iran and toward Israel's covert operations. The Biden administration's approach emphasized diplomacy over covert action. American officials engaged in indirect negotiations with Iran through European and Qatari intermediaries. The goal was to revive the JCPOA or negotiate a new agreement that addressed both Iran's nuclear program and its regional activities. Iran demanded sanctions relief and guarantees that any agreement wouldn't be abandoned by future American administrations. The United States demanded strict limits on enrichment, enhanced inspection protocols, and constraints on Iran's missile program. The negotiations produced limited progress, complicated by Iran's presidential election in 2021, which brought hardliner Ebrahim Raisi to power. Raisi's government took a more aggressive stance on nuclear development. Iran announced that it was enriching uranium to 60% purity, just below the 90% threshold for weapons-grade material. Iran also restricted international inspections, removing surveillance cameras from some facilities and limiting inspector access. These moves were calculated provocations designed to increase leverage in negotiations, while demonstrating that Iran wouldn't be intimidated by assassinations or sabotage. The message was that external pressure would accelerate Iran's nuclear program rather than stop it. By 2022, Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium exceeded the amount needed to build multiple nuclear weapons if Iran chose to take that final step. The exact timeline for weaponization became a critical intelligence question. Western agencies estimated that Iran could produce enough weapons-grade uranium for a bomb in a matter of weeks if it decided to do so. The remaining technical challenges involved weaponization, building a functional warhead, testing the design, and integrating it with delivery systems. Fakhrizadeh's death had degraded Iran's weaponization expertise, but Iran had enough residual capability to eventually solve those problems. Israel watched these developments with growing concern. The strategic calculus had shifted. The assassination campaign had bought time but hadn't stopped Iran's program. The gap between Iran's current capabilities and actual weapons possession was narrowing. Israeli military planners developed options for airstrikes against Iranian nuclear facilities, but such strikes carried enormous risks, military, political, and strategic. A bombing campaign would only set back Iran's program temporarily unless it destroyed every relevant facility, which was unlikely given Iran's dispersed and hardened infrastructure. It would also unify Iranian society around the nuclear program and potentially trigger broader regional conflict. Israeli intelligence continued operations against Iran's nuclear program, but shifted tactics again. Direct assassinations became less feasible as Iranian security improved. Instead, Israeli operations focused on disrupting Iran's supply chains and procurement networks. Iran needed specialized equipment to build advanced centrifuges and maintain its enrichment facilities, high-grade steel, precision machinery, vacuum pumps, electronic components. Most of these items were subject to international sanctions and had to be acquired through black market networks. Israeli intelligence tracked these networks and interdicted shipments, either by tipping off law enforcement in transit countries or by sabotaging the equipment before it reached Iran. One operation in 2021 involved contaminated centrifuge components. Iranian procurement agents in Turkey purchased precision bearings for centrifuge rotors. The bearings appeared to meet specifications and passed Iranian quality control checks. They were installed in new centrifuges at Natanz. Several months later, the bearings began failing prematurely, causing centrifuges to vibrate and eventually destroy themselves. Iranian engineers investigated and discovered that the bearings had been manufactured with deliberate flaws that made them fail under the stress of high-speed rotation. The sabotage set back centrifuge operations and forced Iran to recheck thousands of components that had been acquired through similar procurement channels. These supply chain attacks were less dramatic than assassinations, but potentially more effective at slowing Iran's program. Every component had to be tested and verified. Every supplier had to be vetted. Every procurement operation risked delivering sabotaged equipment. The cumulative effect was delay, uncertainty, and degraded efficiency. Iran's nuclear facilities operated under constant suspicion that their systems were compromised, which created a corrosive environment for scientific work. Iranian intelligence adapted by developing domestic manufacturing capabilities for critical components. If foreign procurement channels were compromised, Iran would build the equipment itself. This required significant investment in machine tooling and precision manufacturing, and it required time to develop the expertise. Iran made progress, but domestic manufacturing couldn't match the quality and sophistication of equipment available through international markets. The result was a nuclear program that advanced more slowly and with more frequent technical setbacks than it would have if Iran had unrestricted access to international supply chains. The intelligence war expanded into new domains. Both Israeli and Iranian intelligence services conducted aggressive counterintelligence operations targeting each other's networks. Mossad arrested Iranian intelligence officers operating in third countries. Iranian intelligence arrested suspected Israeli spies in Tehran. Both services ran disinformation campaigns designed to deceive the other about operational intentions and capabilities. The operational environment became increasingly hostile, with each side trying to disrupt the other's intelligence gathering while protecting its own sources and methods. One of the most significant counterintelligence coups came in 2022 when Iranian intelligence arrested an MEK network that had been operating in Tehran for years. The network had provided surveillance support for the Fakhrizadeh assassination and other operations. Iranian interrogators extracted information about communication protocols, dead drop locations, and safe houses. The information led to additional arrests and effectively destroyed Mossad's most productive intelligence network inside Iran. Rebuilding would take years and require recruiting entirely new sources. The loss of the MEK network forced Israeli intelligence to rely more heavily on technical collection, satellite imagery, signals intelligence, cyber penetration. These methods provided strategic intelligence about Iran's nuclear facilities and military capabilities, but they couldn't replace human sources for operational planning. Israeli intelligence needed people inside Iran who could provide real-time information about targets' movements, security measures, and vulnerabilities. Without those sources, conducting operations like the Fakhrizadeh assassination became nearly impossible. Iran's counterintelligence success created a temporary advantage. Iranian nuclear facilities operated with less fear of sabotage or assassination because the networks that supported such operations had been dismantled. Iranian scientists returned to more normal work patterns. Security measures were relaxed slightly. The program made faster progress. By mid-2023, Western intelligence agencies estimated that Iran's breakout timeline, the time needed to produce enough weapons-grade uranium for a bomb, had shortened to less than 2 weeks if Iran made the political decision to proceed. This created a crisis decision point for Israel. Accept that Iran would likely acquire nuclear weapons capability in the near future, or take military action to prevent it. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who had built his political career on opposition to Iran's nuclear program, faced the most difficult decision of his tenure: launch airstrikes that might trigger regional war, or rely on diplomatic efforts that had failed repeatedly to stop Iran's progress. His military commanders told him that airstrikes could set back Iran's program by 2 to 5 years, depending on the scope of the attacks and the damage achieved. His intelligence chiefs told him that Iran's response would likely include massive rocket attacks from Hezbollah in Lebanon, potentially causing thousands of Israeli casualties. The decision was complicated by Iran's own strategic calculations. Iranian leadership knew that acquiring nuclear weapons would transform their security situation and their regional influence. But they also knew that the final steps toward weaponization would trigger Israeli military action unless handled with extreme care. Iran needed to advance close enough to breakout capability to have rapid weaponization available as an option, but not so close that Israel felt compelled to attack preemptively. This delicate balance required careful calibration of enrichment levels, public messaging, and diplomatic signaling. In late 2023, Iran made a strategic decision that shifted the entire dynamic. Iran announced it would cap uranium enrichment at 60% purity and accept enhanced international inspections in exchange for partial sanctions relief. The announcement came through diplomatic channels rather than public statements, delivered to European intermediaries who were facilitating indirect negotiations between Tehran and Washington. Iranian officials explained that the decision was pragmatic. The economic cost of sanctions was unsustainable, and the risk of Israeli military strikes was increasing. They needed relief now more than they needed weapons capability later. Israeli intelligence analysts debated whether the Iranian offer was genuine or tactical deception. Iran had made similar promises before and violated them. The 60% enrichment ceiling was significant because it represented a psychological threshold. Iran would remain close to weapons capability, but wouldn't cross into territory that would force immediate Israeli military response. The enhanced inspections would give international observers better visibility into Iran's activities, but Iran had previously restricted or expelled inspectors when it suited their interests. The question was whether this time was different. Behind the diplomatic messaging, Israeli intelligence possessed information that suggested Iran's decision was driven by internal factors as much as external pressure. The decade of assassinations had created severe problems within Iran's nuclear establishment. The younger generation of scientists who should have replaced the killed experts had been recruited into the program reluctantly or not at all. Iran's nuclear facilities were staffed by aging scientists working with inadequate support and limited resources. Technical problems were mounting. Projects were behind schedule. The weaponization expertise that Fakhrizadeh had accumulated over decades remained fragmented among his former subordinates, none of whom had sufficient authority or knowledge to integrate the separate components into a functional weapons design. Mossad received intelligence reports from sources inside Iran's nuclear program describing the actual state of affairs. One report came from a scientist who had worked under Fakhrizadeh and felt disillusioned after his death. The scientist described a program that had lost direction and coherence. Research teams worked on separate pieces of weapons technology without understanding how those pieces fit together. The metallurgy specialists didn't communicate effectively with the explosives experts. The trigger mechanism designers weren't coordinating with the missile integration teams. The problem wasn't lack of knowledge in specific domains. Iran had competent scientists in each specialty. The problem was the absence of someone who understood the entire system and could make the thousands of small decisions that transformed theoretical knowledge into functional hardware. The source explained that Fakhrizadeh's real contribution hadn't been his personal research, which was often derivative of work published in international journals. His contribution was management, his ability to coordinate different research streams, identify technical problems before they became critical, and maintain institutional memory across projects that spanned years or decades. That capability couldn't be replaced by promoting his deputies because none of them had developed the same breadth of experience. They understood their specialties deeply, but lacked the integrated knowledge that comes from overseeing an entire weapons program from concept to production. This intelligence revelation changed Israeli strategic assessment. The assassination campaign hadn't just killed individual scientists, it had decapitated Iran's nuclear weapons program at the management level, and that decapitation created organizational damage that persisted years after the physical deaths. Iran could still enrich uranium, Iran could still conduct research on weapons components, but Iran couldn't efficiently integrate those capabilities into a functional nuclear arsenal without the expertise that had been systematically eliminated between 2010 and 2020. Israeli analysts recognized that Iran would eventually rebuild that expertise. Someone would emerge who had the technical knowledge and leadership ability to coordinate the program effectively. But that process would take years, possibly a decade or more, because such expertise develops through accumulated experience rather than formal education. The assassinations had bought time, not permanently, but substantially. The question was whether that time would be used productively to achieve diplomatic solutions or wasted while both sides prepared for the next phase of confrontation. The diplomatic negotiations gained momentum through 2024. Iran agreed to freeze enrichment at current levels and allow international inspectors access to previously restricted sites. The United States agreed to waive certain economic sanctions, particularly those affecting Iran's oil exports and banking access. The agreement was limited and fragile, with both sides maintaining the capability to withdraw if violations occurred. But it represented a temporary de-escalation of the crisis that had dominated the region for more than a decade. Israeli leadership accepted the agreement reluctantly. Netanyahu had been replaced by a coalition government that included parties with different views on Iran policy. Some ministers argued that the diplomatic agreement was preferable to military strikes that would cause enormous casualties and might not permanently solve the problem. Others maintained that any agreement that left Iran's nuclear infrastructure intact was unacceptable and that military action remained necessary. The coalition's internal divisions prevented decisive action in either direction, creating a default policy of cautious monitoring combined with continued covert operations at reduced intensity. Iran's strategic shift didn't end the intelligence war. Mossad continued operations to disrupt Iranian nuclear procurement and sabotage equipment. Iranian intelligence continued targeting Israeli interests through cyber attacks and proxy operations, but the intensity decreased. Both sides recognized that the immediate crisis had passed and that escalation carried risks neither wanted to accept. The shadow war continued at a level that maintained pressure without triggering open conflict. The assassination campaign's legacy extended beyond the immediate tactical impacts. The operations demonstrated that even hardened targets in denied territory could be reached with sufficient planning, intelligence preparation, and operational patience. Other intelligence services studied the methods and incorporated lessons into their own planning. The use of remote weapon systems became more common in targeted killing operations globally. The integration of cyber capabilities with physical operations became standard practice. The emphasis on supply chain sabotage as an alternative to direct action influenced multiple intelligence agencies' operational planning. The campaign also revealed the limits of targeted killing as a strategic tool. Assassinations could eliminate individuals, degrade organizational capability, and buy time. But they couldn't permanently destroy a state-sponsored program that had political support, financial resources, and a large pool of technical talent to draw from. Iran's nuclear program survived the assassination campaign and continued advancing toward weapons capability, albeit more slowly and less efficiently than it would have without the disruption. The strategic question was whether that delay justified the operational costs, the diplomatic complications, and the risk of escalation. Iranian intelligence conducted its own assessment of what went wrong. The most damaging factor had been the penetration of Iranian society by foreign intelligence networks. The MEK provided much of the infrastructure, but there were also opportunistic recruits, people motivated by money, ideology, or personal grievances who provided information or logistical support. Iranian counterintelligence implemented stricter vetting procedures for anyone with access to sensitive facilities or information. They also increased surveillance of Iranian diaspora communities in Europe and North America, attempting to identify individuals who might be approached for recruitment. The most significant counterintelligence improvement was technological. Iran invested heavily in electronic surveillance systems that could detect unauthorized communications, track vehicle movements, and identify unusual patterns of behavior that might indicate intelligence gathering. These systems were imported from China and Russia, countries that had their own sophisticated surveillance capabilities and were willing to share technology with Iran in exchange for strategic cooperation. The deployment of these systems made human intelligence operations more difficult for foreign agencies and forced shift toward technical collection methods that were less vulnerable to counterintelligence detection. By 2025, the operational environment for intelligence operations in Iran had changed fundamentally. The networks that supported the assassination campaign were mostly destroyed. Iranian security measures had improved, to the point where conducting operations like the Fakhrizadeh killing would be exponentially more difficult. The survivors of Iran's nuclear program worked under heavy security in facilities that were hardened against both physical attack and technical penetration. The window for targeted assassinations had effectively closed. This didn't mean that Iran's nuclear program was safe from disruption. Israeli intelligence shifted focus to longer-term strategies that didn't require personnel inside Iran. Cyber operations could be conducted remotely. Supply chain sabotage could be executed in third countries before equipment reached Iran. Diplomatic pressure could be maintained through intelligence sharing with allies who had their own concerns about Iranian nuclear capabilities. The confrontation continued, but the methods evolved to match the changing operational environment. The human cost of the decade-long campaign was substantial. 5 Iranian nuclear scientists were dead. Dozens of support personnel, drivers, security guards, technicians, were killed or wounded in the attacks. Hundreds of suspected collaborators were arrested, and many died during interrogation or lengthy imprisonment. The psychological impact on Iran's scientific community was profound. Scientists who remained in the program worked under constant surveillance and security restrictions that made normal life impossible. Many experienced stress-related health problems. Some developed paranoia about colleagues and neighbors. The environment was corrosive and damaged scientific productivity even beyond the direct impact of the assassinations. Israeli intelligence personnel who conducted the operations also paid costs. Several operatives were captured during operations and imprisoned in Iran. Their fates remained classified, but intelligence community sources indicated that at least 3 Mossad officers died in Iranian custody. Others suffered psychological trauma from the stress of operating in hostile territory under deep cover for extended periods. The professional costs included the destruction of intelligence networks that had taken years to build and would take years to rebuild. The diplomatic costs included strained relationships with allies who opposed the assassination campaign and questioned its strategic value. The fundamental question remained unresolved. The assassination campaign delayed Iran's nuclear weapons program, but it didn't stop it. Iran retained the capability to produce weapons-grade uranium and was developing the expertise to build functional warheads. Israeli military planners continued preparing for potential airstrikes against Iranian facilities. Iranian military planners continued preparing for retaliation through proxy forces and direct missile attacks. The confrontation remained frozen in a state where both sides possessed capabilities to inflict serious damage, but neither wanted to trigger the escalation that would follow. Regional dynamics complicated the situation further. The normalization of relations between Israel and several Arab states through the Abraham Accords created new diplomatic alignments that Iran viewed as threatening. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain shared Israel's concerns about Iranian nuclear capabilities and were willing to cooperate covertly on intelligence sharing and operational planning. This created a coalition of states surrounding Iran that had both the motivation and the capability to disrupt Iranian activities. Iran responded by strengthening ties with Russia and China, seeking protection through relationships with powers that could balance American and Israeli influence. The assassination campaign became a case study in intelligence schools globally. The operations were analyzed for their tactical execution, their intelligence preparation, their operational security, and their strategic impact. Some intelligence services concluded that targeted killings were effective tools for disrupting adversary capabilities and should be used more aggressively. Others concluded that assassinations created more problems than they solved, and that alternative methods of disruption were preferable. The debate continued, informed by the Iranian experience, but complicated by the fact that each intelligence operation occurred in unique circumstances that limited the generalizability of lessons learned.